The night my son-in-law handed me a cup of tea and said, "Get some rest. Graham, we've got everything under control." I should have listened to the part of me that had never trusted him. Not once. Not from the very first Sunday he walked through our front door in Tauranga with that pressed collar and that rehearsed smile, shaking my hand a little too firmly, the way men do when they're selling something. But I was 63 years old, tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep, and my wife Margaret was ill. When someone offers to carry the weight, you let them. That was my first mistake. I need to go back further than that tea, though. Further than the diagnosis. Further than the wedding. I need to go back to who Margaret and I were before any of this began. Because if you don't understand what we built together, you won't understand why losing it nearly killed me, and why what my son-in-law did was not just a betrayal. It was a calculated demolition. Margaret and I met in 1987 at a hardware trade show in Hamilton. She was working the counter for her uncle's timber supply business, and I was there representing the small building company I'd started with 2 mates from Polytechnic. She laughed at something I said, I can't even remember what, and the sound of it stopped me completely. I stood there like a man who'd walked into a glass door. She told me later she noticed because most men in that room were trying so hard to be impressive, and I just looked surprised to be alive. We married in 1989. Our daughter Claire was born in 1993. By the time Claire was 10, our building company had grown into something real, residential, and light commercial work across the Bay of Plenty. 11 staff, contracts with 3 local councils. I was away more than I should have been. That is a plain fact. I will not dress up. Margaret ran the house, raised our daughter, kept the books for the first 8 years of the business, and still found time to be the kind of woman people rang when they needed steadying. She was the center of everything. I was the one who kept moving, kept building, kept telling myself the work was for them. Claire grew up clever and restless. She did well at school, moved to Auckland for university, came back to Tauranga at 24 with a communications degree and a boyfriend named Darren Whitfield. Darren was 31, worked in property investment, drove a car that cost more than my first house deposit. He was polished in the way that always made me feel like I was missing something. Like everyone else could see what was underneath the polish, and had decided it was fine, and I was the only one still squinting. Margaret liked him. Plain. That was the thing I kept coming back to whenever my instincts flared up. Margaret was not a naive woman. She had been reading people clearly her whole life. So I told myself I was being an overprotective father. I told myself I was being territorial about my daughter. I told myself a lot of things. They married in 2019. Claire was 26. The wedding was at a vineyard outside Napier. Darren's choice. Naturally. He gave a speech that was perfectly calibrated. Funny enough to seem relaxed. Sentimental enough to seem genuine. Just long enough to seem important. I watched the room respond to him and felt something I couldn't name. Not jealousy. Something colder. Margaret's health began changing in 2021. Small things. At first fatigue that didn't lift after sleep. A persistent heaviness in her joints. Headaches that arrived without warning and stayed for days. Our GP referred her to a specialist in Hamilton. The diagnosis came in late March. An autoimmune condition, manageable with medication and rest. Not life-threatening if treated properly, but serious enough to require ongoing monitoring and real lifestyle adjustment. She was 61 years old, and suddenly, the woman who had always moved through life with such sureness was having days where getting out of bed felt like swimming upstream. I reduced my work hours. I was there for appointments, for the bad days. We talked more in those months than we had in years. I think illness has a way of burning off the noise and leaving only what's real. Darren and Claire started coming around more often. I noticed Darren asking questions about the business, about our finances, about the property we owned. He framed them carefully. casual interest. Son-in-law curiosity. Once he asked about our wills and I deflected, and he laughed and said something about estate planning being important. Nothing serious, just being practical. I mentioned it to Margaret that night, and she said I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was. Then in August 2022, Margaret had a significant flare-up. She was hospitalized for 4 days. When she came home, she needed daily support, medications on a strict schedule, limited physical activity, rest. Claire immediately offered to move in temporarily to help care for her mother. Darren would come after work and on weekends. It seemed like exactly the right thing. Claire was attentive and warm. Margaret was comforted by having her daughter close. I had a major project finishing up in Rotorua, a community center rebuild, council contract, penalty clauses if we missed the handover deadline. The timing was brutal. I drove back to Tauranga every night for the first 2 weeks, staying as long as I could, leaving before 5 in the morning. But I could see Margaret was being well looked after. The house was clean. Her medications were being given on schedule. Claire was cooking for her, sitting with her, watching evening television together the way they used to when Claire was young. I told myself the contract would be done by November. I told myself 3 months was manageable. What I didn't know was that Darren had, by September, already begun having quiet conversations with our family solicitor. I didn't know because our solicitor, a man named Peter Forday who'd handled our affairs for 16 years, was also the solicitor who had acted for Darren's father on a commercial lease 2 years earlier. A small world. A convenient one, as it turned out. The first sign I noticed was in October. Margaret seemed quieter when I came home. Not sad, exactly, more distant. Like she was watching me from further away than usual. I asked if she was feeling worse physically. She said no. She was just tired. I asked if everything was all right between us, and she reached for my hand and said, of course it is. But her eyes were doing something I'd never seen them do before. Something uncertain. I thought it was the illness. I thought the autoimmune condition was affecting her mood, her clarity. The specialist had mentioned that could happen. I am telling you this so you understand that when you love someone and you're afraid for them and you're exhausted and carrying a heavy load, your mind will reach for the most bearable explanation and hold on to it. In November, Claire told me that Margaret had been unsettled on the nights I was away. Restless, anxious, not sleeping well. She suggested it might be better for her mother's recovery if the environment stayed as calm and consistent as possible. She said the back and forth of me arriving and leaving might be disrupting Margaret's rest patterns. She said it gently, with what appeared to be genuine concern. She said maybe it would be better if I stayed in Rotorua through the week and came home only on weekends until the project finished. I stood in our kitchen and looked at my daughter and felt something I still struggle to describe. It was like looking at a painting you've known your whole life and suddenly noticing there's a door in it you never saw before. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it. That night I sat in the car in the driveway for 40 minutes. I rang my oldest friend, a man named Barry Sutton who'd known me since we were both apprentices, who had the kind of plain speech that cuts straight through. I told him what Claire had said. There was a silence on the other end of the phone, and then Barry said, "Mate, that's your house. That's your wife. Don't let anyone manage your access to your own wife." I went back inside. I didn't agree to Claire's suggestion. But things shifted after that. Margaret started mentioning, in small ways, how much better she slept when it was quiet. How the weekday routine Claire had established was really working well. How the project would be done soon and then we'd have all the time in the world. I don't know if she was saying these things because she believed them or because someone had been saying them to her first. I still don't fully know. What I do know is that in the first week of December, I came home unexpectedly on a Tuesday. The Rotorua Council had pushed a handover meeting back by 2 days. I let myself in quietly. Margaret often rested in the afternoons. I could hear voices in the kitchen. Darren's voice, lower than usual. And someone else. A woman I didn't recognize. I walked to the kitchen doorway. Darren was sitting at our kitchen table with a woman in her 40s, professional looking, a folder open between them. When he saw me, his expression did something fast and complicated: surprise, recovery, a performance of ease in about half a second. "Graham," he said, "didn't expect you today." "Clearly," I said. The woman began gathering her papers. Darren introduced her as a financial advisor he'd consulted on behalf of the family. "On behalf of the family," said in our kitchen, at our table, in our house. I asked him to leave. He left. I asked the woman who had engaged her services. She said she wasn't in a position to discuss client matters. She left. I went upstairs to Margaret. She was awake, propped against pillows, a book open on her lap. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at her and I said, "Margaret, I need you to tell me honestly. Has Darren spoken to you about the business? About the property?" She looked away first. That told me everything and nothing. She said Darren had explained some things about asset protection, about making sure that if her health deteriorated, there were structures in place. She said he'd told her it was about protecting me too, protecting what we'd built. Alni. She said she hadn't signed anything. She repeated that twice. I kissed her on the forehead and told her to rest. I went downstairs and I sat at the kitchen table where that folder had been opened 20 minutes ago, and I made a decision that I should have made months earlier. I was not going to wait any longer to understand exactly what was happening in my own home. The next morning, I drove to Hamilton and walked into the office of a solicitor named Vivian Hartley, who had been recommended to me by the accountant who'd handled our business taxes for a decade. I told Vivian everything I've just told you. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than you'd think. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Whether Margaret had given anyone power of attorney, whether any joint assets had been transferred or were in the process of transfer, and whether I had any documentation of the financial advisor's visit. I didn't have answers to the first 2. For the third, I had the woman's business card, which she'd left on the table in her rush to gather her papers. Vivienne told me we needed to move carefully and quickly. She engaged a private investigator that same week. I didn't tell Margaret. I didn't tell anyone. I went back to Rotorua, finished the last 2 weeks of the project, came home each weekend as if nothing had changed, sat with Margaret in the evenings, watched her face for signs of what was happening beneath the surface. The investigator's name was Ross Haig. He was 50-something, former police, the kind of man who explains things once and expects you to have kept up. Within 10 days, he came back to me with the beginning of a picture that made my hands go cold. Darren had engaged the financial advisor, a woman with a firm in Auckland that specialized in trust restructuring to prepare documentation for the transfer of our family home into a discretionary trust. The trust deed, as drafted, gave Darren and Claire joint trustee control, with Margaret listed as the primary beneficiary. My name was on the beneficiary list, but with conditions attached, conditions related to my capacity to manage financial affairs, which was a phrase that had no basis in any medical assessment of me, because no such assessment existed. Someone had simply inserted the possibility of my incapacity as a mechanism to limit my access to decisions about our own home. The documentation was not yet signed, but it was ready. And from what Ross could piece together, the intention was to have Margaret sign during a period when her symptoms were at their most pronounced, when she was tired, when her thinking was slowed by medication, when her resistance was lowest. Margaret had told me she hadn't signed anything. I believed her. But I understood now that the conversation about signing was coming. There was something else. Ross had spoken to a nurse at the medical practice Margaret visited. He was careful about how he approached this, within legal boundaries, and learned that Margaret's treating nurse had flagged a concern in her notes about the regularity and dosing of one of her medications. The concern wasn't about the prescription. It was about whether Margaret's reported symptoms were consistent with the prescribed dose, or whether they might suggest the medication was not being administered as directed. I sat in Ross's office and read that part of his report 3 times. I am not a man who cries easily. I have lost a business partner, a father, a brother. I know what grief feels like in the body. But sitting in that office in Hamilton reading those words, something broke in me that I am still not entirely sure has healed. I rang Vivienne from the car park. She told me we had enough to act. She told me what we needed to do and in what order and how fast. I listened to every word. What happened next, I did not do alone. Vivienne coordinated with a senior GP, who agreed to conduct an unannounced welfare assessment of Margaret. Barry drove down from Auckland and stayed at a motel in Tauranga, so he was close if I needed him. Ross continued gathering documentation. I went home. I want to describe that last drive home clearly, because I've thought about it many times since. It was an evening in mid-December, light still in the sky at 8 o'clock, the harbor visible between the hills, the air that particular Tauranga warmth that I've known my whole adult life. I drove the route I had driven 10,000 times, and I thought about the man I had been for the past year. The man who told himself the business had to come first. The man who accepted without question that his daughter was just trying to help. The man who explained away every instinct that tried to get his attention. I thought about what my wife had been going through in that house in the evenings, in the quiet, with her illness and her medication and the wrong kind of people telling her what was sensible and necessary and kind. I pulled into the driveway and I turned off the engine and I sat there and I made myself a promise. Not a dramatic one, just a plain, quiet promise to myself that I would never again mistake busyness for love, or silence for trust, or the absence of evidence for safety. I walked inside. Darren was there, as he often was on weeknights by then. He stood up when I came in. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the performance in his face had time to flicker, and then I said, she was having a better day. She was sitting up, had eaten a real dinner, was reading a novel. She looked at me when I came in, and I think she saw something in my face, because she put the book down and said, "Graham, what's happened?" I sat beside her and took her hands and said, "Nothing yet, but I need you to trust me for the next few days. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I've always trusted you. I just forgot to tell you that." Recently, I don't know if she knew, on some level, what was coming. Margaret has always been perceptive in ways that are hard to explain. I think she may have had her own doubts that she'd buried because the alternative was too painful. I think illness and exhaustion had made her more dependent on the people around her than she'd ever been in her life. And dependency creates a kind of fog. It becomes difficult to distinguish between care and control. The following morning, Vivienne served notice on Peter Ford that she was now acting for both Margaret and me, and formally requested all documentation related to any trust structures, powers of attorney, or asset transfers involving either of us. We also lodged a complaint with the Law Society regarding the potential conflict of interest in his acting for both our family and Darren's father without full disclosure. By noon, a copy of the draft trust deed was in Vivienne's hands. The GP visited Margaret that afternoon. The assessment took an hour and a half. Ross's initial concern about her medication was raised carefully, clinically, in a way that didn't alarm Margaret but opened the door to a proper investigation. Margaret herself raised questions during that assessment that she told me later she'd been carrying for weeks Questions about whether what she'd been feeling matched what she should have been feeling given her prescription. The answers that came back over the following days were serious enough that Vivienne engaged a forensic health specialist and a financial crimes investigator. Not because we were certain of what had happened, we were not, but because we had accumulated enough to say, this requires proper examination by people with the proper authority. Darren and Claire were asked to leave our home. Claire was told why. I will not describe what that conversation was like. Some things should stay private. I will say only that it was the most painful hour of my life, and that my daughter did not, in the end, deny what had been planned. She said Darren had made it sound reasonable. She said a number of things that I think she believed even as she said them. I don't know what to do with a person who convinces themselves that what they are taking is something they deserve. I genuinely do not know. What I know is that my daughter is my daughter, and that some roads are long, and that I am 63 years old and still capable of being surprised by how much I don't understand about people I thought I knew. Margaret spent 4 days in hospital for a proper assessment and medication review. Her treating specialist confirmed that her dosing over the prior 2 months had been inconsistent. The matter was referred to appropriate authorities. The legal process around the trust documentation and the financial advisor is ongoing, and not mine to describe in detail here. What I can tell you is this. We are home. Margaret and I are home together. She is having more good days than bad ones. We have a different solicitor now, and a different GP, and a security system I installed myself because I still know how to use a drill and a spirit level. We have Barry coming for dinner most Saturdays, which Margaret says is excessive, but I notice she always makes his favorite dessert. Our daughter and I are in a process that I do not have a clean word for. It is not reconciliation. Not yet. It is not estrangement. It is something more like the careful work of two people trying to find out whether a bridge is still there after a flood, testing each plank before putting weight on it. What I want to say to you, if you've stayed with me this long, is something I wish someone had said to me clearly and plainly about 10 years ago. The people who love you will not need to manage your access to the people you love. That is not a rule with exceptions. If someone begins gently reducing the time you spend with a person who matters to you, even with soft explanations, even with apparent logic, that is the first plank of a structure you should not let them finish building. Pay attention to the person who is ill or vulnerable, not just to the people caring for them. Illness does not only affect the body. It creates dependence, and dependence creates exposure. Be present, not occasionally. Consistently. When your instincts speak, do not reach for the most comfortable explanation. Your instincts have been paying attention to things your conscious mind has been too busy to register. They are not always right, but they deserve to be heard, not silenced. The things you build over a lifetime, the businesses, the properties, the savings, are not the point. The point is the person you built them alongside. Do not let a single day go by where that person does not know clearly, in plain language, that they are the point. And to the men my age, the ones who drove to work every morning for 30 years, telling themselves that providing was the same as being present, I know. I was there. It is not too late to close the distance. Not in most cases. Not if you move now, before the silence in your house becomes something harder to explain. Margaret is calling me from the kitchen. Something about the tomatoes in the garden needing attention and whether I remembered to water them yesterday, which I did not. I am going to go and be honestly, undefensibly wrong about the tomatoes, and she is going to be right. And that small, ordinary rightness of her is the thing I almost lost without ever fully understanding its value. Go home. Be there.